It's barely just begun, but it is clear that Russia's invasion of Ukraine will be a major historical turning point, the consequences of which we can only begin to imagine. This is not just because the potential to upend the global order is huge, but also because it's still early and we do not yet know what the war's endgame will look like. Still, we can outline what the potential scenarios might be and how they could change the world. If you want to know what those are, join me in this brief look at the potential ways in which the Russian invasion of Ukraine will end. Scenario number 1. Russia takes over Ukraine, imposes a puppet regime in the next year or so, and annexes Ukraine outright. Ukrainian resistance has been fierce, but the Russians are still advancing, and over the long run, it is unclear if the Ukrainians can hold on. NATO and Biden have been clear that they will not confront the Russians directly, and although they are arming the Ukrainians, they cannot stop the shelling of Ukraine's cities, which might eventually weaken the Ukrainians enough for the Russians to be able to either kill Zelensky and his administration or force them to flee. With the legitimate Ukrainian government either dead or in exile, and assuming the Russians had enough control of territory, they would look for collaborators to be named as the new government, which would then negotiate an annexation to Russia. This was probably Putin's original goal, which he, no doubt, thought would be accomplished within the first week. It wasn't, but even a year might not make much of a difference to him. What would be the consequences of this? Of course, no one would recognize the new government or the annexation this side of Belarus, nor would this be much of a win for Russia in the long run. The territorial incorporation of Ukraine would only be possible with an occupation, and this would sap much Russian blood and treasure, especially as the Ukrainians would have unlimited access to weapons from NATO. Russian leadership might not care, however, and this could easily become a decades-long trouble spot like Palestine or northern Cyprus. Meanwhile, with the Ukrainian army and legitimate governments destroyed, it would be infinitely harder to restore the status quo, which might in turn embolden Russia to take even more aggressive steps in the future, including against the Baltic states or Moldova. Under this scenario, Sweden and Finland might be even more likely to join NATO, leading to an isolated and impoverished Russia, but one creating constant headaches for everyone else for the foreseeable future. Scenario number 2. Russia cannot take over Ukraine, and a stalemate develops, but the country is destroyed. It's early, and Russia has already turned to shelling the country. This is both a sign of weakness and a terrible omen for Ukraine, because it's clear that at least for now, Russia cares very little for the human cost and the subsequent images this produces. Unfortunately for Ukraine, the resistance plus Western sanctions could very well not be enough to stop Russia, in which case the war could go on for years, even with the Ukrainian government intact. What would be the consequences of this? This would leave a much weaker and isolated Russia, a stronger NATO, and Russia less likely to attack other countries. The humanitarian toll, however, would be enormous. There's already over 1 million Ukrainian refugees in the European Union. This would add several more. Not to mention the millions that would die. Even worse for the Ukrainians, after a few months, their deaths could very well be normalized, just like those of Afghanistan or Syria. After a while, their stories would recede from the headlines, and the world could very well move on to other things, especially if there are other global crises. The Russian economy would pay a very high toll, as would its military, but with Putin still in power, nothing much would change. Scenario number 3. Stalemate leads to a compromise that returns a version of the status quo ante. That is, Russia retains the Donbas republics, and Crimea and Ukraine stay out of NATO. The Russian government has already proposed this. Ukraine has not accepted it, however, mostly because Ukrainians do not trust that A. Russia would actually pull out its troops, and B. Giving any legitimacy to Russian annexations of Ukraine could set a bad precedent. In other words, Ukraine thinks that this would lead Russia pocketing their gains, regrouping, and then attacking again. But a prolonged war might force both sides to compromise around this general outline. What would be the consequences of this? Even though this would be a massive loss for Russia, given that this was the de facto situation before the war and would essentially mean that the economic losses and casualties of war would have been for nothing, it would still leave the president of a country annexing territory by force. Even worse, this probably would not resolve the underlying issues and might simply freeze the conflict. Scenario number 4. Putin replaced in a palace coup. Russia pulls out its troops. Russia's military has faced a huge logistics problem, not just in maintaining their soldiers supplied, but also protected, and thus has faced not just a much higher level of casualties than expected, including that of high-ranking officers, but also the loss of tanks and other important hardware that has simply been left for lack of fuel. This, coupled with stiff Ukrainian resistance and unprecedented Western sanctions, increased the possibility that Russia might eventually not be able to field an army. At that point, life inside of Russia would already be precarious given the massive economic upheaval. If the military was suddenly put out of commission as well, authority could easily break down, and a potential removal of Putin could occur. At that point, the coup plotters could simply blame everything on Putin, could pull out whatever troops they had left, and could negotiate peace, including the removal of sanctions. What would be the consequences of this? This scenario has the most upside, but also the most uncertainty for the world. Removing Putin would not guarantee either stability or democracy in Russia, and instability in nuclear power is always dangerous. It is also not clear how China might react in all of this. The war could very well place Russia in a subservient position to Chinese interests, so they would not be pleased to see a coup. Nonetheless, this still has the potential of a massive turning point. The democratic Russia allied with the West that people envisioned at the end of the Cold War could finally happen, and if it did, it would completely change the world dynamics, and probably only for the better. Meanwhile, although those are the most likely scenarios, there's a fifth one that is both the most dangerous and the hardest one to predict: a nuclear war. To be sure, I don't think this will happen, but whenever there's a nuclear power involved, there's always a possibility. So let's consider how this could occur. In theory, this could happen in just about any of the scenarios if Putin is desperate enough, but it could also occur if the war expanded to a NATO country, deliberately or accidentally. At that point, all bets are off because once a single nuclear weapon goes off, it is impossible to predict whether strikes could be limited or would end up encompassing the entire planet. What is clear is that nuclear war would end life as we know it, even if it was limited to a few cities. Because at the very least it would destroy the global economy, not to mention that it would leave massive political instability in its wake. And with that happy thought, let's hope that this war ends with as little bloodshed and trauma as possible.